All right, I got 231. So we'll do a soft start here. You know, at our booth down there, we're giving away fidget spinners. And I was thinking if somebody answers like, you know, questions, I can hurl them into the audience. I was told that would be bad. So I'm not going to do that. If y'all want one, you can come up later and pick one up. So the funny thing is downstairs in the expo center, folks are coming up to our booth and they're going like, wow, this is really something. Who are you guys? And so does anybody know who we are? I mean, there's some folks, you're not allowed. There's some folks that, yeah, you know who we are? Okay. So I figured I'd take this opportunity to kind of tell you guys a little bit about our pedigree and that we're not necessarily as much of a startup as it may appear. So most folks are familiar with Quest software. You know, Quest software has been around for a really, really long time. Started with, you know, really powerful tools around Unix environment and Active Directory environment and whatnot. And we, along with a bunch of other software companies, were bought up by Dell a couple years ago. And in preparations for Dell's acquisition of EMC, their $57 billion acquisition, I don't remember how much it was, they basically sold everything. So Perot systems, Quest software, you name it. So for the folks who aren't familiar with us, that's really who we are. We're Quest software, but we took the entire inventory of security tools that were part of the Quest inventory and rebranded them as One Identity. And so, you know, there's some One Identity folks in the room. We have two emails at the moment, you know, a oneidentity.com and a quest.com. So again, for the folks that are kind of saying, you know, who are these guys? That's really who we are. So we've been around for a really long time. We've been doing this stuff for a really long time. The purpose of this first session, and then George is coming after me. The purpose of this one is we're going to talk about busting the myths of authentication and authorization. We're kind of uniquely positioned to do that, quite honestly, because George and I and some of our colleagues here, we're basically engineers. We're not really salespeople, but we're brought into sales opportunities. We're brought into conversations with executives and whatnot to talk to them about security and consult and whatnot. So we're not always selling, but selling is one of the things that we do. And quite honestly, very often we bring up, you know, solutions and we bring up ideas and whatnot, and we're constantly bombarded with myths. We can't do that because of this. We can't do that because of that. And so some of the stuff we're going to talk about here are just kind of the myths that we hear in the industry quite a lot. And again, like I said, given our position of meeting with basically another company almost every single week, and you know the same companies week after week and whatnot, we hear a lot of these things. And so it's important that we kind of get these things out of the way, because when we're slaves to myths, we end up making the wrong decisions, right? And so let me move this over a little bit. Let's get started, and we'll take a look at the first myth we're going to talk about today. And I have a tendency to turn and whatnot. Hopefully you guys can still hear me if I'm turning and on this microphone here. The first myth is one that I really quite enjoy. It's the myth of the reverse proxy and why reverse proxies are bad. So, yeah, reverse proxies are bad, okay? People would rather stick with their VPN. So what do people use it for? Let's look at the little message down here. VPN technology is still one of the most widely used methods of granting users access to intranet resources from the internet. Companies use this type of technology not only for their own employees, but also for their partners. Is using a reverse proxy a viable alternative for VPN? When I talk to customers and I start talking to them about this, quite honestly, there's a couple different reasons why this is myth number one. I'm a huge proponent of reverse proxies, and I'm quite, I don't know what you'd say. I'm quite strong on VPN being a Trojan horse, quite honestly. It's absolutely necessary in certain circumstances. I'm not going to tell you guys that you need to shut off your VPN under all circumstances, but clearly there's a problem with VPN, and we're going to talk about that. But really, we're also going to look into, you know, what's so wrong about reverse proxy. So why do people have VPN software in place today? There aren't too many other reasons than this, right? So my employees need access to applications behind the firewall. My partners need access to applications behind the firewall. And generally speaking, you either have partners or you have users who you've given an install to or a script or instructions. Here's how you configure this in your environment. And I often talk about folks that are like at a public library, and you get a text message or something like that that says, hey, you need to connect to the HR system right away. Otherwise, you're in big trouble. Who knows what the use case is? God forbid somebody installs your VPN software on a library computer, right? Let's say that that was an open environment, or they install it on their phone and they leave their phone somewhere, et cetera. But this is basically the scenario that I go in and I talk to customers and I see that they're doing this today and I say, you need to use reverse proxy. And that's when they kind of go like, I'm going to stick with my VPN. So this is a technical diagram of VPN technology. And just so folks realize what we're talking about, it's not really complicated. My colleague George has a story, historical, I wouldn't call it historical fiction, but it's just history, about how firewalls basically got created, right? So in the early days of the internet, the golden days, at the time I was working for Amdahl Corporation, and the internet was brand new, and I had engineers that were in the Middle East and in Europe and whatnot, and we could get on the internet and instantly exchange ideas, ask questions. We even had VoIP technology back in the very, very early days of the internet. It's funny, I talked to my aunt who works for AT&T. Before the internet really gained, I don't know if y'all had these conversations, it was just classic. She worked for AT&T, and I told her I was having conversations with people in Saudi Arabia that weren't costing me a dime. And she said, you are wrong, that's never gonna happen, it's impossible. Anyway, she came back years later and she said, sorry, you were right. What happened though in those early days is that it was a really friendly environment, right? It were engineers, scientists and whatnot that were communicating with each other, and then finally some lawyer, right, sent an email somewhere with spam in it, and then everything turned south since then. So people realized that there are bad actors on the internet, so they created the firewall technology, right? And that's what we've got here. We've basically got the internal network, we've got a firewall, and after they put the firewall up, they realized, there's certain things we need to let through the firewall, right? And so if you look at the edge of the firewall, we've got these ports that are there in the front. One of them's for email traffic, one of them's for simple message protocol, who knows what type of traffic is going through, but we basically needed to open up these little portals to let that type of information go back and forth. My argument is when we say to someone, oh, you need to get access to a website, you need to get access to some sort of a service or whatnot, and you're a partner, or maybe you're an employee, let me lower the drawbridge and just let you in behind the castle wall. That's what a VPN is to me, okay? There's some nuanced arguments here, but let's just go with it for a second. So basically, I've got these people that are either good or bad, I'm not entirely sure, but some of them have weapons. They're gonna come into the network, and I've got my defense network internally here, right? These guys on the left of the drawbridge right here, those are my network engineers, those are my firewall engineers. And they have guaranteed me that the locks to the keep are good, we've done this, we've done that. What I'm saying is that all these people needed to do was maybe deliver some fruit, or maybe they're coming here to get some messages about which other network they're supposed to be attacking. We might have been able to open up a port and just send that information through rather than lower the drawbridge and trust that our internal network engineers have got it right? So let's go a little bit deeper into this. I regularly call VPN the Trojan Horse. And if anybody saw my earlier session this week, I say it every time. I feel really, really sorry for picking on target, but the breach on target is just an absolute perfect use case of this calamity of errors and calamity of configuration things and whatnot that just caused tremendous destruction, quite honestly. It wasn't necessarily that someone attacked their VPN. I mean, the initial step in the target breach was a phishing attack on the HVAC contractor, right? But they actually saw the credentials get replayed to access the VPN. At that point, the drawbridge is down, and you're basically letting in an attacker. And again, we're trusting that our engineers and our network engineers have safely secured the the SQL environment, safely secured the point of sale, application servers, and all these kinds of things. But the first thing an attacker is going to do when they come in is they're going to look for the things that you forgot. You didn't patch this IIS server. You didn't patch this Apache server. This SQL over here has a default password still in it, or whatever the situation may be. As an attacker, the first thing we're going to do is scan. And since you let us into the network, now you have a huge vulnerability. Thus, the Trojan horse, right? The VPN is a Trojan horse, and I won't beat it to death, but the point is that you don't necessarily need to do that. If you remember the ports that we were talking about on the firewall, and we're talking now about what type of technology do these people actually need to get access to, it's something that can be done through a port, right? So this is really what you need, and what is it, a Sally door, Sally gate, you call it Sally port, or some sort of a little portal that you can open, And you're not actually letting these people into the network. Instead, you're just saying, tell me what you need to tell me. I'll give you what you need. You don't need to let them into the network, because right now I'm focusing on web technology, right? We know what port those are, right? Those are port 80, port 443. Really simple to get that access. With a reverse proxy, for those that don't know what it is, basically every single person here that works for a corporation, generally speaking, when you access the internet from behind the company firewall, you're going through a proxy. We call it just a basic web proxy. That's all a reverse proxy is. It's a web proxy, okay, for the purpose of this conversation. When you access the internet from behind the company firewall, there's a couple things that are doing. A lot of proxies are going to authenticate you, right? So authentication is fairly standard. Some of them do it through Kerberos. Some of them, the browser will pop up a dialog saying, tell me who you are. And the reason why I'm doing that is so I can figure out what asset you're trying to access out on the internet you can. And an analogy or a story I told earlier on Tuesday, or was it Monday? Monday, was about a coworker I had whose job it was to do social networking for our company, okay? This is a long time ago, different company. They literally took away his access to access Facebook and Twitter and all these kinds of targets. Even though it was his job, they locked down the outgoing proxy. And we had to work, it's a long story, we had to work to basically say, what do we need to do to let this person through, okay? This proxy that's basically blocking traffic outbound, like when I try to go to a gambling site or something like that outside the corporate firewall, it's going to authenticate me, it's going to say what site are you trying to get to, and it's going to say whether or not it can get there. That's what happens when you go outbound from a corporate network to an internet site, right? We want to make sure you're not browsing things that we don't want you to browse. A reverse proxy is exactly the same. It's called reverse only because rather than the person internally in the network saying, I need access to something on the internet, it's just simply kind of looking the other direction. Someone on the internet can now have access to something internally on my network. So rather than VPN, what we say is set up our reverse proxy or a reverse proxy, and then literally from the internet, I can say, I want access to this internal HR site. I'm going to do the same thing your outbound proxy is doing. I'm going to authenticate you. I'm going to figure out whether or not you can get there. I'll execute risk, et cetera. And then basically my proxy will go behind the corporate firewall, get that website, and send it to you, okay? So let's look at some of the myths regarding reverse proxies. VPN technology is the best way to provide internet access. All right, this myth is kind of honestly easy to bust because it just simply isn't. And you're putting too much at risk if you're using VPN to give access to partners, even your own employees. It's just simply not safe. And again, the Target breach is a great example of a person who had VPN access, who was very innocently compromised by the Citadel virus, who saw his credentials being replayed or played, and then it just got simply compromised. We cannot put the trust, we should not put the trust on our network engineers that everything has been secured properly and that when someone comes through that drawbridge, that there's another secure gate and they really can't get to what they want to get to. Because we've been shown over and over and over and over again that this isn't the case. Even by network engineers that said, no, we've got this, our VPN is secure. It just simply isn't. Reverse proxies are slow. They create a bottleneck. Usually what I tell folks is if the reverse proxies are slow, remember, this is just standard web technology. This is a web proxy. Your entire corporation is streaming out to CNN and whatever they're browsing to. Your proxy's handling the traffic just fine. Now, granted, there's something different happening in a reverse proxy, okay? There's string manipulation of the URLs and the pages that you're loading and whatnot. Those strings are being changed. Back in the 90s, reverse proxies were slow, okay? Back in the 90s, video games had, 32-bit color. Right? Now, we're far beyond that. We're basically in virtual reality at the moment. The technology hasn't changed very much from what we had in the 90s, but the processing power to do simple string manipulation is light years beyond what we had before. All right? And so basically the myth is I can't put a reverse proxy in because it's not as fast as my VPN. It's just simply not the case anymore. And if you're with a vendor that has a slow reverse proxy, maybe look for a different type of technology, right? Look for something that can prove that it's fast. There are some cases, I'll tell you, where it might be slow. In my experience, to be totally honest with you, generally speaking, it has to do with an application that was just horribly architected, right? Something that's just constantly streaming data back and forth. It just isn't necessary. And you shouldn't do that in a web technology anyway. Anyone browsing this from a phone is going to have massive charges, right? They need to be architected a little bit more efficiently. But the simple fact is, just look at the myth, and I've been told this flat out, I'm not putting your reverse proxy in because it's too much of an application bottleneck. It's just not true, all right? This isn't your dad's reverse proxy, all right? This is a modern reverse proxy. And then what I've already kind of said over and over again here, it's the myth that your first myth, Joe, about the Trojan horse, that's not the way it is here. And then, 3 weeks later, you're in Wall Street Journal saying, I told you so. Just simply don't trust. Yeah, that's what the folks who got fired said. So one last anecdote about reverse proxy, and hopefully I'm making it clear kind of what the technology is. There's a slight expectation that you guys are somewhat familiar with these things as we get in here, but I had one customer, again, for the folks that came in a little bit late, this is what we do for a living, and we're constantly barraged with myths about all these types of technologies. So these are things we hear a lot. But I had one customer say, flat out, reverse proxies are not secure. And I said, really? I said, okay, if you were to browse to CNN's website right now, right? I'll pick on CNN. She says, okay, I'm on CNN's website. All right, now, scan their network for a vulnerable SQL server. I can't do that. I said, okay, well, why don't you try to attach to the database that their media engine is running? Well, I can't do that, right? And I'm like, you're making my point for me. You're realizing what I'm telling you. There are no vulnerabilities when the only thing, well, for the sake of argument, there are no vulnerabilities when the only thing you can do is hit port 443 of CNN's website and get some sort of internal resource. When you let the drawbridge down, you're crossing your fingers saying, I hope my network engineers got this right, okay? Reverse proxies are the way to go, right? Dump your VPN unless it's entirely necessary. You're going to get the performance you need, and it's way more secure, especially when you layer upon it things like risk, step-up authentication, all that other kind of stuff, right? Now we're doing intelligent access. We're going to make sure that the access is secure. Let's see. That myth is busted. Let's go to the next one. And hopefully we'll have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. I think we do have plenty of time, so if anybody wants to raise their hand and tell me I'm wrong, the door is open, just right out the door. I'm just kidding. Multi-factor authentication. This is interesting. Your users do not want multi-factor. Face it, there seems to be a wide acceptance from the experts that MFA would have nipped most attacks at the bud. All right, all security experts know this. Everyone in this room probably knows this. So why aren't we doing it? Are there really roadblocks that keep users from accepting MFA? The Office of Personnel Management breach, it's a good one, right? People talked about the fact that, well, I won't get into that. I'll try to keep my analogies kind of down a little bit. Let's just take a look at this picture. This happened in Washington, D.C. last week. Basically, what's the big deal, right? Why do users hate doing this? And I'm going to tell you flat out, users hate doing MFA. I've been at sites where I've been consulting with companies, and we're talking about their security strategies, and they start talking about MFA. I start asking them about this. This is a no-brainer. If you guys don't have MFA in place today, take every single priority you have on your list, shift it down, and put it at the top. But the reason why you don't is because of what we're talking about right now, right? It's the myths of MFA. I've literally had customers come to me and say, we're not implementing it, right? They bought it from us, they're not doing it. I say, why not? Well, the VP of whatever called and said he hates it and he wants us to turn it off. Right? Who's had that experience where like some executive has said, hey, I know that you're doing something good, but please turn it off because it's bothering me, right? This happens all the time. The reason why users don't like this, let me see, I think it might be on the next slide. No, let's not get to that. It is confirmed, but the reason why users don't like this, it's a couple different reasons. The first thing we need to make sure we do when we have MFA is, actually I do think I have it, hang on a second. It's confirmed. Let me see. Yeah, it's confirmed. Users don't like it. And not only do they not like it, I've literally seen MFA projects fail because somebody who used to get access to something quickly is not getting it anymore, and it's a pain in the butt, right? So, in true Mythbusters culture, sometimes when something's confirmed, they try to figure out how to do the opposite, right? So how do we take the fact that users don't like this and change it? All right, these are basically how we bust these myths. You have to provide users the token choices they want. There's a couple of different roadblocks to MFA, and one of them is, this is crazy. My sister has a flip phone, right? She doesn't run apps. This is honest to goodness truth. She has a flip phone. She doesn't want to run an app on her phone. I've got my workstation locked with MFA, and I'm on a plane, right? One identity can lock up your workstations, right? Now you're on a plane, you're getting a multi-factor challenge. and your productivity in first class as an executive is killed because you can't log on to your workstation. You can with us, right? We have solutions for these things. But the simple fact is that the token options I need, so what are token options? Let's talk about that. Generally speaking, in multi-factor, you hit an environment, you log in, and it says, hey, you need to give me a token, right? A one-time password. So we use text messaging for that. We use YubiKey for that, like a Go7 little device or something that presents some sort of a unique one-time password. It's just a simple string of numbers. And you type that in and it says, okay, now I know it's you. It's the second factor, right? But the simple fact is, if you're not providing your customers with enough token options that meet their culture or their disabilities, right? We've got customers that are blind, that are using YubiKey devices, right? And they're using some sort of a device on their computer that can read to them what the screen is saying. But if you said something like, okay, now open your mobile phone and give me the token that's on there. Well, I'm blind, I can't see it, right? So make sure you have a YubiKey device. You press the button, it puts the code on the screen for you. If you like hardware devices, there's a Randy Franklin Smith. A lot of people know Randy Franklin Smith. He prefers to use a hardware device on a keyring. He doesn't like the mobile phone option. And the reason why is because he says, when I need a token, I go, bam, I've got it. Some people like SMS text messaging. Some people like phone calls to be made, right? It's a simple fact. If you don't give the customers something that matches their culture, any Windows Phone heroes in the room, or am I the only one?
You always ask that question. No, you're the only one.
There's usually one sucker in the room. Yeah? I got to hang out with your wife. No offense, but I want to meet her. So we provide Windows Phone tokens, right? We still do. We provide BlackBerry tokens. You know, you can go into the Windows Phone App Store and you can get it. The simple fact is that some people have this device, some people have that device. We offer cloud-based multi-factor, right? Starling is our cloud platform. We offer it. At the moment, Starling, just like every other cloud provider out there, right, still has a culture, and we're changing that very actively, but they still have a culture of the phone is the way to do it. Almost all multi-factor providers have the phone as the way you get your token. That's still not good enough for a lot of corporations, and we're actively changing that, broadening the types of tokens that we support. If you don't do this, right, then your users are going to hate doing this, and they're going to revolt, and you're going to end up turning it off because you're killing productivity, right? The next thing, if you remember the picture, if I pull it back up again, this picture here, this lady's sign says, "Stop MFA harassment now." Okay, what is multi-factor harassment? Let's get back over here real quick. So multi-factor harassment is something where, and here's an easy use case that we can all understand. We log into our computer, we access the internal HR site, and what does it do? It gives us a multi-factor prompt. Right at that moment, we get our multi-factor token, we type it in, and right then your kid comes up and says, "Dad, I need to check my Minecraft server," or whatever. Okay, fine. So you log out, the kid comes in and he goes, "Oh, you know what? Never mind." Okay, no big deal. Go back to the HR site, and what happens? I get bludgeoned with multi-factor. I see it again. When you do this, in combination with something crazy like not giving people tokens that match their culture, now you have a problem where people basically feel like they're being harassed by multi-factor, and they're going to ask you to turn it off. This is one of those situations where the industry has changed dramatically. I think easily 3 years ago, 4 years ago, at Cloud Identity Summit, everybody was talking about risk-based analytics, behavioral analytics, things like that. All right, what this is, if you look at the top one, behavioral analytics and then some other types of things you can do, you need to make sure that your multi-factor decisions are being made intelligently. The fact that I just gave you a token when I logged into my HR site and my kid asked me to do something, I log out, I log back in again, you shouldn't be asking me again. My IP address hasn't changed, the time of day isn't different, I'm still logging in from Southern California. You know, there's literally no reason to do this anymore. So the industry, in case you guys aren't aware of it, has shifted dramatically to saying, let's not make things harder for our users to log in, let's actually make it easier for users to log in and take away these barriers. You can only do that if you have the computing power behind the decision making that can do these types of analysis on the connection that's coming in and saying, you don't need a multi-factor prompt. I'm not going to give you one, right? We can do that these days. Most people are kind of saying, I can't implement multi-factor unless I'm not bludgeoning my users with it. If you don't do this, your MFA project might fail, right? If you're not giving token choices and you're not giving an ability to do it intelligently, you're running into trouble. Myth number 3, I think we only have a few more. but I could bring up a whole bunch more if someone has a question. What about this myth? Yeah, we can talk about that. This one's a great one. I quite honestly see people making this mistake all the time. So the myth is that federation isn't enough, right? So let's take a look at, by now, just about everyone has embarked on an SSO project, or is just about to. If you haven't done it already, you're looking at it, and probably looking at it here. Sometimes the choice of how you do it or who you go with, it seems obvious. But is modern federation enough? That alone, is modern federation enough? What will I be missing? So, basically, when I'm talking about modern federation, I'll try to take a step back and kind of explain this a little bit more. There's so many terms that get mixed and matched and used incorrectly. And again, being an engineer, I can be fairly, narrow focused on this stuff. But a lot of people just say, I need a single sign-on solution, all right? And when we're talking single sign-on, the knee-jerk reaction is, what is single sign-on? Well, it's SAML. I need SAML. Sometimes you need WS Federation if you're connecting to something like a Microsoft technology, generally .NET apps like SharePoint. Some of their more native languages are things like WS Federation. OpenID, OAuth, that kind of technology, really popular in the social networks and on the internet, consumer-based federation between services and people. When a company goes and does, this is the experience I have, again, because this is what I do, right? When a company is in the middle of doing an SSO project, inevitably we'll get called, and I have to sit down with them and say, what else are you looking at? And they say, well, I'm looking at this, and I'm looking at this, or this company that just got breached a couple weeks ago. And I kind of go, okay, so the problem is that you're telling me you're only looking at these technologies, right? SAML, WS Federation, and OAuth. You're choosing technologies that are basically only federation. And the simple fact is that the inventory of applications you're connecting to, some of the ones behind the firewall, some of the ones on the internet. George, you'll remember this. George and I were talking with a customer, the only one we've seen at this point, and this is totally true. It's a Silicon Valley company, very, very, everybody knows who they are. They're 100% cloud. They don't have a single on-prem solution. I've never seen it before, 100% cloud. And I asked him, of the cloud, basically he was desperate for what we're talking about here. We've made a mistake. We went with single sign-on, and now this is what we're suffering, and we're going to get into it in a second. So I said, how many sites are you connecting to, being a corporation of your size, that's 100% cloud? How many sites are you connecting to that support SAML and WS Federation and OAuth? It was crazy. It was like 30%. It was like 30%. Now, most people in the room are going to say that's wrong. There's no way. But most people in the room here are not going 100% in the cloud, right? We only use cloud when it supports Federation and SAML. Imagine going all in, and now you're dealing with sites. Let's see. That might be on a follow-up slide. They don't have the preview slide up here, but basically what you're missing are sites that are using form fill. You're missing sites that are still using Windows authentication or Kerberos, most often behind the corporate firewall, third-party applications that we install internally that don't speak SAML. We're missing things like, God forbid, header injection. I think I have it up here somewhere. Basically, if you implement something that does federation only, all right, and this is what I'm trying to get the point home, you basically have a tool that does that really, really well. It's like a screwdriver, right? I can speak SAML to Google Apps. I can speak SAML to O365. But when someone comes along and says, hey, we've got this application out here that has form fill or has a login form, there's a couple responses that are given by the security folks. One of them is, rewrite your app, right? No, well, the guy that wrote the app threw himself in front of a bus about 6 weeks ago, so we can't do that. Hey, you're living in the past, man. Everything's SAML. Or they just basically leave you out of the story. And one of the goals by most organizations, it's really funny, one of the goals by most organizations when it comes to single sign-on and federation is they really want to make their users happy. I hear this all the time. I said, what's driving you to do this? Well, my users are tired of using user IDs and passwords. I want to make it easier for everybody. And I kind of go, that's great, but you're missing the security implications here. Single point of access for all the applications, right? You turn off an Active Directory account, and every single cloud-based federated application, you can't log into it anymore, right? That's a huge security feature. Here's the thing, though. If all you've done is federation, and you flip off that Active Directory account, technically people still have access to these other targets because they're not being secured by a single SSO provider or web access management solution, right? If you're interested in making your users happy, it's great that they can get into O365 and Google Apps and whatever it may be using federation, but then they turn around and they go use the digital asset library that uses, I got to remember my user ID for that, I could use it. Web technology is still more broad than just simple federation, right? That's the point I'm trying to make. If you go with a single sign-on provider that only supports federation, you're going to have a security risk because you can't adequately audit what people are accessing outside that single sign-on platform, and you're going to have a user issue because users are going to be upset that you did it for this app and this app, how come this one's not being done? I could go into a little bit more detail about this too. Making sure that you do it correctly is a big deal. LastPass, I'm not casting dispersion on them. LastPass is a great solution, but the fact that I might need to actually have a browser plugin kills the productivity of my users when they do go to the public library and they want to get access to something and have single sign-on to it, but it's missing a browser plugin. Our solutions can't have agents being installed on target servers. That's ancient technology. And they can't have browser plugins or any sort of requirements on the type of browser you're using. They have to work everywhere, all the time, to anything. SAML, login forms, header injection, basic authentication, et cetera. They got to do everything. This is the type of WAM, web access management, or the type of single sign-on platform that you need. It's not just a screwdriver that does federation. It's a multi-tool that does all the web technologies that we're still interacting with. When you leave these technologies out of your SSO story, you're inviting risk into your environment, right? So again, just briefly, these are the other types of technologies that people just still continue to miss. Generally speaking, when I get in with a customer and I say, who are you looking at? And they say, well, we're going with this or we're going with that. And I kind of say, that's great. Do you have any sites that still do this? And they say, yeah, but that's not part of our project. And I go, well, why not? Well, because these other vendors don't do that. Well, you shouldn't be making that mistake, right? There's too many risks of basically saying, I'm going to leave these apps out of my story. And you'll make your users happy at the same time, because now rather than just saying, hey, we've made these federated sites single sign-on, everything in the inventory is single sign-on, right? I know how to automatically log people into form fill sites, sites that are using Kerberos in different domains. We can do everything, right? It's a pretty important myth that needs to be fixed. So basically, the question is, if I go with an SSO strategy where I'm focused only on federated applications, is that enough? No, it's not. All right, so this myth is confirmed. Federation isn't enough. Broaden your horizons a little bit and make sure that you cover all web technologies. Again, make your users happy with everything and make sure you don't have any gaps in your security profile, right? Everything needs to be audited, everything needs to be secured. So this one's a little different. It's kind of a change on the topic of authentication and authorization, but at the core, the use case still centers on authentication and authorization. And so I'll tell you what this technology is, secure password vaulting. I'll explain what it is in a second. Let's just read this bullet here. Some say the idea of secure password vaulting is a widely implemented technology. I've literally had some people tell me, everybody does that. That's like 90s technology. I totally disagree. All the time, I see customers that need this type of technology and haven't implemented it sometimes, and it usually evolves into a conversation where we start talking about this myth that our admins are going to revolt if I lock up their passwords. Again, I'll explain what this technology is in a second. Many have refused to implement this simple technology out of fear that they will kill productivity and generate a user revolt. What's the truth? So this is what happens when you tell a Unix admin or a Windows admin or a domain admin, we're going to enable secure password vaulting. So let's take a break and talk about what this is. Trying to think, I have complicated examples and ones that are fairly more simple. So let's just take a standard Windows administrator. If you think about where the risk in your organization comes from, there's clearly risks from people who have access to sensitive data. If they have access, they're allowed to the sensitive data. It's a risk that your business needs to take. It's the cost of doing business. Then there's the type of risk where I have an employee in my company who can literally bring the company to its knees. All right? I can cripple Active Directory. I can go into a Unix server and install things they shouldn't be installing. I have basically what we call privileged access. It's also a risk or a cost of doing business, all right, to have certain people in the organization that literally have the keys to the kingdom. Hopefully it's a small group and you have some sort of a management around there. What this technology is that I'm talking about, right? The notion of secure password vaulting. Really, I'm talking about admin accounts. It can be much broader than that. But the idea is that I go to the admins that have access to your servers, your root access servers, Unix servers, Windows servers, you name it. And I say, the user ID and password that you have in your brain, again, I brought this up in an earlier session. Anybody who's familiar with the XKCD cartoon where they're trying to hack this guy's password and they're spending millions of dollars to do it, and then finally the guy says, I've got a $5 wrench, let's just beat it out of him, right? If I know the password, you're going to get it because one identity is not worth someone putting things underneath my fingernails, so no offense. But the point is that I shouldn't even know the password. So what we do is we basically inventory all the sensitive accounts in the enterprise. Again, things like root access or admin access to Active Directory, admin access to things like SAP, admin access to SQL servers, any sort of privileged access you have. And we basically take that password away from them and store it in a secure server. There's multiple companies that look into this type of technology. What that secure server is going to do is it's immediately going to log into that SQL server using that sensitive user ID and password and change the password. Right? As soon as you register it in a secure password vault, it should reach out and change that password. So now, literally, the SQL Server admin, the Unix server admin, they don't even know the credentials anymore. So when you take that wrench out and beat him over the head and say, tell me the password to the Unix server, he's going to, I don't know it. And he legitimately doesn't, right? So the process now for that root admin or that AD admin, et cetera, to get their job done can be cumbersome if we don't do this right. The idea is now I say, hey, I've got to get access to the server, so I go to the secure password vaulting system, I log in, I should execute risk analysis, right? Behavioral analytics. I'm going to step him up the multi-factor if I need to, but then the person says, this is the server I'm trying to get access to, and we can actually show him, here's the password. We can email it to him, plain text it to him, whatever you want. That's one scenario. I'll get into this a little bit more deeper in a second here. But then I take that password and I go log into root, or I go log into Unix, or I go log into Active Directory. And when I'm done, I can go back to the library and basically say I'm done with this, and it'll reach out and change the password again for me. I'm allowed to do this, right? This is my job. Another example is, well, I'll talk about the other example in a second. This is what these people start saying, though, and I would feel the same way. Being a senior developer in years past, if people took away the credentials and the keys that I needed to do my job, I would freak out. So they say things like, I can't work. I'm not going to be able to get my job done. Or you're going to put my credentials where? This is never going to work. And then they get the personal hurt feelings. You don't trust me. No? Well, no. What if the password solution crashes, right? There's all sorts of excuses people bring out to say, I'm not willing to do this because I don't want to make people unhappy. I don't want my people to quit and whatnot. Right? So these are the myths around this type of technology. Let's take a look at some things here. The truth is, privileged access management solutions can become nearly transparent. If you're implementing it correctly, and you're talking to the customers, and you're talking to the users, and you're saying, tell me how you do your job. What methods do you want to use to get these things? It can actually become faster, is my argument. So we've gone to customers and we've said, again, the same customers are saying, this is not going to work. My people are going to revolt against you. And I say, let's just do a POC and take a look at this stuff. We, for instance, have a platform where when you connect to a secure server, like an AD server or Unix or whatnot, you actually do it through our platform. And we can literally show you, here are the servers you normally work with. I don't even need a password, folks. I go there and I say, I want access to this root server. It's almost equivalent to double-clicking on it, and the next thing you know, a root console window opens up to Unix. It's logged in for me with a user ID and password I didn't know. And as I'm executing privileged sudo commands, it blocks those commands, says, hey, you can't do this command, you can't do this one, right? So I can actually filter commands people are executing. I can do that against a Windows environment too, right? So the idea of like, well, let me open up Task Manager or open up Run and spawn something. You can disable that if you agree with your engineers and say, hey, let's meet together and partner on this and make sure we lock certain things down. I can actually make this process faster, all right? But the simple fact is, I don't know if I have this on my next slide or not. The simple fact is, there's two people that are going to benefit from this greatly. Simply the fact is, this isn't going to hurt your admins at all. Time after time after time after time, we've implemented this type of technology. And we've said, did your worst fears come true? And they say, no, it's much easier than we thought it was. But here's the thing I want you guys to remember. This type of technology is absolutely essential for 2 reasons. For the corporation, you simply can't have people walking around that know admin credentials to anything, all right? You're asking for trouble. George, he's coming up next. I can tell you right now, he's a loose cannon. It makes me very nervous that he has credentials to anything. I'm just kidding.
Get that a lot.
Yeah, but the thing is that we're not only, this is what we need to share with the engineers. We need to share with the engineers, look, you're the guy that has the credentials. George, John, they have the credentials. If something goes wrong, every finger in the organization is going to be pointing at you, right? It's not just about protecting, this is how we explain this to our admins. It's not only about protecting our company, but I want to make sure that you're protected. Because like with our solutions, if something goes wrong, he can go, by the way, that little pass-through, getting access to root, getting access to Windows, it's all recorded in a DVR. Every single command that's executed, it's a video, you play it back. And he can say, go watch the recording. I didn't do anything, right? So we're protecting the admin too. And once I explain to them that, pay attention and go look at the lawsuits that have been filed against admins that have credentials. I don't want this to happen to you, right? So I'm not going to interfere with your productivity. I'm going to actually protect you in the long run. It's not, you basically, we share with them, it's not only about protecting the corporation, it's about sharing or protecting you as well. Last one, folks, and then maybe we'll have some time for Q&A. I think we should. This one's a little bit shorter, I think. I probably won't beat it up to death, but we get this a lot when we talk about identity governance and identity management. And it's the question of, or the statement that, hey, role-based access control works just fine. Who needs attribute-based access control? It seems the world runs on role-based access control, or RBAC. Managing groups in Active Directory is simple. People get access to what they need. Is this true? Is RBAC enough? Well, let's take a look at some of these things. Right out of the box, I can tell you that some of the problems with basically doing simple role-based access control is, and let's talk about what that is, okay, for the folks that may not be familiar with it. Let's say you have a bank, and we have tellers, and we have bank presidents, and we have research people, and we have investors. One of the roles that we're going to set up in a bank is going to be something like maybe the role to deposit a check. Or maybe you're a teller role. And if you have the teller role, you instantly get access to this SharePoint library and this set of functionality and this application over here, et cetera. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to just create all these roles. The problem is roles are statically assigned, right? We're just by nature, the fact that I've said I've got George here and I'm going to make him a bank teller means at some point in history I'm going to make him a bank teller. We all know the issues with identity and access management. When George changes his role from a bank teller to a janitor, he's still a bank teller, right? He can still deposit and withdraw transactions and all this kind of stuff. Clearly, that's bad. Roles become stale. That's basically the example there. It's very difficult for George to provide someone else a role temporarily while he goes on vacation, because again, he'll have to go in there manually, provide the role. We want to make sure that when he comes back, he's removed that role. We've got things like overprivileged people, right? People who have been assigned too many roles than they should have had, et cetera. But one of the interesting ways to look at it is this way. And I think George puts it a lot better than I do. Let's just take a look at this. Let's say we want to create a role called who can do a really lousy commercial, right? So I'm going to say, well, if you belong to the group called lawyers, and if you belong to the group in Chicago, and if you're an ambulance chaser, right, you're part of that group too, then you have this role membership called you have the ability to make commercials. What's happening here is that I have a proliferation of roles because I'm using roles to calculate roles. I have a proliferation of roles that is just starting to grow out of control. Because basically what I'm doing is here is I'm duplicating what I could probably get just by simply looking at attributes. I could look in SAP and find out that this person's job code is a lawyer. I can look in the HR database and find out that this person lives in Chicago, right? I don't know where I'm going to look to see if they're an ambulance chaser. That's in some like training system. I don't really need these things. What we need to do is we basically need to say, let's take a look at the attributes that people have and generate roles dynamically in real time, day to day, hour by hour, minute by minute. If we change our strategies from role-based access control to attribute-based access control, then all we need to do is go to this bottom box and say, hey, there's a role we're creating. It's called, can you make commercials, really lousy ones. And now I just say, if you're a lawyer here and you live in Chicago here and whatever here, so as soon as you move to Chicago and you become a part of that organization, the role pops up automatically, right? No one has to do this for you because it's calculated in real time based upon attributes. I don't have this massive proliferation of roles in my database. I just simply have the definition for a single role that says, if you have this, 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 and this. And then again, when you change, move from one department to another department, it automatically goes away, right? So basically, we still see this a lot today is the point. I'm sure no one in this room does this. But if you're not making dynamic decisions based upon user attributes, you're opening yourself up to a lot of problems. The least of which is role proliferation. This particular role, or this particular thing, this is busted, right? RBAC isn't enough. We need an identity management system that's powerful enough to make these decisions in real time. We need application decisions that are powerful enough to say, can you deposit a check? Even there, I wouldn't look at a role. I would look at some attribute and say, my application layer should be looking at this attribute. If you are a teller in the HR system, yes, you can deposit a check. Why am I even looking at roles to begin with, right? Attribute-based security is the way to go. I didn't really beat that point up too much, but quite honestly, that's the last slide I had. So a couple different myths there: multi-factor authentication, role-based management, password vaulting, single sign-on, et cetera. Anybody have any type of questions? Yeah, there's one here.
So I get that VPN is not the right solution to facilitate access to web applications that you might be posting behind your corporate firewall. But would a reverse proxy supplement or be give any added benefits to say, a pinhole or VPN, and then you can whitelist, say, your cloud web application firewall vendor, you're only allowing their IPs in. What additional benefit would you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the question was basically, if you do a reverse proxy in lieu of a VPN, what additional safeguards can you put upon it, right? Simplify the question, I think. So you can go get a reverse proxy for free, right? Apache Tomcat has a reverse proxy built into it. Install that in the DMZ for folks that don't know DMZ. Put that in the DMZ, configure it, and then cross your fingers because there's no security in it whatsoever, right? So you have to augment that. Don't do it if you don't have any sort of intelligence put against it, right? So very easily, any reverse proxy worth its salt is going to be capable of putting whitelists, blacklists, all sorts of different controls on it. Geographical blocks, for example. Like right out of the box, put it this way, if you guys have people attaching to your VPN today and you have no idea whether or not those connections are coming from North Korea, like at all, like risk analysis should be able to do that for you. So I wouldn't implement reverse proxy unless you had some sort of risk analysis on top of it, in my opinion. And it's easy to do. It's like depending on, if you go with Apache Tomcat out of the box, you get what you pay for. It's free, right? So you're not going to have all these protections available to you. So the statement that please do whatever you can to dump your VPN in lieu of reverse proxy, don't do it without having the safeguards on top of it that were kind of mentioned, right? I don't know if I answered your question at all, but. Yeah.
We tunnel all the traffic through them and we're firewall. So I guess in a sense they're kind of acting as a proxy on our behalf. Country block listing IP, block listing, malware detection, inspection, all that.
Yeah, so if I'm correct, the only distinction I would try to draw is just making sure that in this particular case that is a reverse proxy and the only port you can ever hit essentially is 443 and that's it. If that's the case, then yeah, you've implemented a reverse proxy and that's what you should be doing. But again, put as many safeguards in place as you can. Yeah? Yeah, you're good. And if you guys, want to get spinners for yourselves or your kids, there's a whole box of them up here. Come grab some. Any other questions? Anything? Yeah, one more over.
So you talked about ABAC a little bit. If you have any customers actually implemented because people trying, and what we're finding is reduces roles drastically, and there's some use cases for it. And we're finding it more difficult to answer the question who has access to what because now we have to all these rules that say if this plus this plus this, then we have to have access. Do you have any magic rules or anything like that that
So the question was, we looked at doing ABAC before. We have done it, and even though we do believe it's reduced the proliferation of roles, it's actually made it more difficult for us to report on what people actually have access to. My response to that is going to be inadequate because I'm going to say that's not our experience at all with what we do. And so the thought that would come into mind is that whatever governance platform you have that's actually managing that may not be giving you the features that you're looking for. I'm going to take a risk here. Would you agree with that, George? George is my identity expert. Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
You want a microphone? Here, take this. I think it's on.
Wow, the view of the bus is fantastic from down here. It's great. No, I mean, I think it's a valid point, right? Which is the nice thing about a role is you can go and look at a role, and in theory, you know what a role has access to, and you can go and say, okay, and we know these people are in the role, and we can go from there. When we move to more of an attribute-based system, you have to kind of sort of do a little bit of interpolation and say, okay, you know, you may have to go kind of the next level and start to kind of unpack those components a little bit. So it's probably a fair assessment that you need to do that it's a little bit harder to do the reporting. The challenge we see with the roles though is you end up with you know, Joe had 3 options in there. You know, you're going to have a role for every possible combination of those 3 attributes, and so it's kind of, you know, you have to kind of think a little bit about kind of where do you want to swallow your poison. That's what I take it.
Yeah, I don't know if that answered your question at all. Yeah, I would say, you know, one of, you know, come to our booth. I have a business card. Take my business card. One of the things that George and I do, totally pro bono, is we just love meeting with people and talking with people about what they're doing and try to answer security questions. So, you know, it's part of. I wouldn't necessarily call it evangelism, but it's more of a. I wouldn't call it a public service. Somewhere in between public service and evangelism. Is folks that call us. We do a lot of CISO meetings.
Right in the middle is masochism, and that's where we spend our time.
We go to a lot of CISO meetings and whatnot, and we just love to talk to folks. And you know, we have a unique perspective because we don't just see what you're doing in your corporation. We see what the NSA is doing, the Army is doing, you know, major corporations, et cetera. So, you know, it's speaking from personal experience working for this Mickey Mouse company I worked for a really long time, you easily get inbred with your own philosophies. And it's great that you guys are here because you're intentionally saying, I don't want to be inbred. Let's hear what's, not just this conference now, or this meeting now, but bringing someone in who's more than happy to say, I'm not here to sell you anything, but just tell me about what you're doing and let's analyze what you're doing. That's one of the things that we do. So it's just give us a call sometimes and maybe we can get a little bit deeper into what you're suffering through and just try to see if there's a way to find a way out of it. And there's another session after this one. I think it starts at...
about 5 minutes.
Really? 5 minutes?
You ran late.
Basically, it's a Mythbusters on identity and access management, not just simply authentication and authorization. Thank you for being here. Appreciate it. And enjoy the rest of your stay. Cheers. Thank you.